The sun was blazing high above the city, turning the movie set into a giant oven. It was the kind of heat that radiates off the concrete and makes the air shimmer. Everyone on the crew was sweating, even the people just holding the microphones or standing in the shade. But in the center of all this heat, Keanu Reeves was working harder than anyone else. They were filming a big action scene for the new movie. It wasn't the kind of movie where they use a green screen and computers to do everything. This was old school. Keanu liked it that way. He believed that if the audience sees the actor actually doing the stunts, they can feel the reality of it. So there he was, dressed in a thick, heavy coat and boots, running down a narrow alley between two fake buildings. He had to jump over crates, slide under a metal bar, and pretend to get hit by explosions that were controlled by the special effects team. The director, a man with a loud voice and a lot of energy, called out "cut" after the fourth take. He wanted to try it one more time, just to make sure the camera caught the dust flying in the air at the perfect angle. Usually the crew would groan or complain about doing it again in such high temperatures, but nobody said a word. They all looked at Keanu. Keanu was standing near the mark where he was supposed to stop. He was bent over with his hands on his knees, catching his breath. A young assistant rushed over to him with a bottle of cold water and a towel. Keanu stood up straight, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and smiled at the boy. He took the water, but instead of drinking it right away, he poured a little bit over his own head to cool down and then handed the bottle back to the assistant, telling him to keep the rest for himself. "Are you good for another one?" the director asked through his megaphone. Keanu gave a thumbs up. He didn't shout, he didn't complain, he just nodded and walked back to the starting point. The crew watched him with a mix of admiration and worry. He was pushing himself very hard. He had been doing this for weeks, coming in early, staying late, and never taking a break unless it was absolutely necessary. They all knew he was tired, but he was a professional. He wanted the movie to be perfect. As he got into position, the makeup artist rushed in to dab some powder on his shiny face so the camera wouldn't reflect the light. She noticed something strange. Usually, Keanu would make a small joke or ask how her day was going. Today, he was quiet. His eyes looked a little glassy, like he wasn't really seeing the alleyway or the cameras. He was staring at a point on the ground, focusing hard just to stay standing up. "You look a bit pale, Keanu," she whispered. "We have a few minutes if you want to sit." He shook his head slowly. "I'm fine," he said softly. "Let's just get it done." The makeup artist stepped back, looking concerned. She signaled to one of the producers standing near the monitors. The producer watched Keanu closely. Keanu took a deep breath, shaking out his arms and legs to loosen his muscles. He looked ready, he looked strong. But if anyone had been close enough to check, they would have seen his heart was beating much too fast. "Action!" the director yelled. The music started playing from the big speakers, and the explosions began to pop on the street. Keanu took off running. This time, he moved faster than before. He jumped over the crates with incredible ease. He slid under the metal bar, his jacket just grazing the surface. He was doing great. It was going to be the best take of the day. He reached the end of the alley and had to stop suddenly and turn around to face an invisible enemy. He planted his feet and raised his prop gun. The camera zoomed in on his face. He looked intense, focused, powerful, but then something changed. The camera operator, looking through his lens, saw Keanu's eyes roll back slightly. His arm, which was holding the gun up high, began to tremble. The director saw it too on the monitor. He opened his mouth to yell "cut," but the words didn't come out fast enough. Keanu didn't fall down like a person who trips. He didn't try to catch himself. It was like someone had turned off a switch inside his body. His knees simply gave way. He crumpled to the hard pavement, landing first on his knees and then slumping forward onto his side. The prop gun clattered loudly against the ground. It sounded awful in the sudden silence. For a second, nobody moved. It was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the generators. Everyone thought it was part of the scene. Maybe he was acting. But then the silence stretched on for too long. "Keanu!" The director's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. Two stuntmen who were standing just off camera were the first to react. They sprinted toward him, jumping over cables and equipment. When they reached him, they didn't help him up. They dropped to their knees immediately. One of them gently tapped Keanu's face while the other checked for a pulse on his neck. "We need a medic, now!" the stuntman screamed. His voice was full of panic. "He's not waking up." The set, which had been organized and noisy just seconds ago, turned into chaos. People were running everywhere. The main medic, a large man who usually stood calmly by the truck, grabbed his red bag and ran as fast as he could. He pushed through the circle of people that had formed around the actor. "Give him space, back up," the medic shouted, dropping to the ground. He checked Keanu's airways and listened to his breathing. Keanu's chest was moving, but it was shallow and weak. His face was pale and covered in a cold sweat. It was clear this wasn't just heat exhaustion. This was something serious. "Call 911, the medic yelled to the assistant director. "Tell them we have a male, late 50s, unconscious, unresponsive. We need an ambulance immediately." The fear on the set was real. These were people who made fake disasters for a living. They staged car crashes and fights every day. But seeing Keanu lying there so still and lifeless was terrifying. He was the heart of the movie. He was the guy who always smiled, who signed autographs for the security guards, who bought breakfast for the whole crew. Seeing him like this broke something in the air around them. The director stood by the monitors, holding his headset with both hands, watching helplessly. He couldn't believe what was happening. Just moments ago, Keanu was running and jumping. Now he wasn't moving at all. Inside the circle, the medic was working quickly. He elevated Keanu's legs slightly to get blood flowing to his brain. He carefully loosened the tight collar of the costume shirt to help him breathe. He kept talking to Keanu, trying to get any kind of response. "Keanu, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." There was no squeeze. There was no movement. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, getting closer and closer. It was a sound that nobody on a movie set likes to hear for real. Usually when they heard sirens, it was just a sound effect added in later. This time, the sirens were for them. A young woman who worked in the costume department was crying softly nearby. She remembered seeing him earlier that morning, drinking his coffee and reading a book in his chair. He had waved at her and told her he liked the design of the jacket she made. Now, that jacket was dusty on the ground, covering a body that wouldn't move. As the ambulance siren grew loud and deafening, the medic signaled for the crew to clear a path. The heavy glass doors of the studio building had been thrown open to let the air in, and now the paramedics were rushing through them, carrying a bright orange stretcher and their equipment. Time seemed to move very slowly. The paramedics took over, checking his vitals and putting an oxygen mask over his face. They talked in short, clipped sentences, using medical words that the crew didn't fully understand. But the tone of their voices said enough. It was bad. They lifted him onto the stretcher with practiced care. His arms hung down limp at his sides. One of his boots fell off as they lifted him, hitting the ground with a soft thud. Someone picked it up, holding it like a sacred object. As they wheeled him toward the exit, the entire crew stood in silence. There was no clapping, no cheering. Just hundreds of people watching their friend being taken away, wondering if this was the last time they would ever see him smile. The sun was still blazing down, hot and unforgiving, but it felt like the temperature had dropped to freezing. The silence was heavy, filled with a scary question that nobody wanted to voice out loud. Is he going to make it? The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing red lights and screaming sirens, cutting through the heavy afternoon traffic. Inside the vehicle, it was surprisingly quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the calm, urgent voices of the paramedics. They worked efficiently, starting an IV line and checking his vitals every few seconds. Keanu lay strapped to the stretcher, his face pale and still, looking smaller than he usually did on the big screen. The man who played heroes who never gave up was now completely helpless, relying on strangers to keep him alive. When the ambulance finally screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, the back doors flew open. The fresh air rushed in, but it didn't help the tension. A team of doctors and nurses was already waiting, their scrubs bright and clean against the grime of the city. They didn't waste a second. They unlatched the stretcher and wheeled him toward the large glass sliding doors that parted automatically to let them in. There were no heavy wooden barriers here, just clear glass and bright, white light that seemed to swallow him whole. The director, the producer, and a few key members of the crew had followed the ambulance in separate cars. They ran into the emergency room, their shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum floors. But before they could get too far, a stern-looking nurse with a clipboard stepped in their path. She held up a hand, not in a mean way, but with a firmness that told them there was a line they could not cross. "You can't go back there," she said gently but firmly. "The doctors need space to work. Please take a seat in the waiting area. We will come find you as soon as we know something." The director opened his mouth to argue, to explain that he was responsible for the man lying on that table, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she was right. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. The group turned around and walked toward the waiting area, feeling like they had just been defeated. The waiting room was a large, open space filled with rows of stiff, plastic chairs attached to the floor. The air conditioning was cranked up high, making the room feel icy cold compared to the heat outside. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow on everyone's face. It smelled like strong coffee and disinfectant, a smell that instantly makes people feel anxious. They sat in a small cluster, away from the other people waiting. There was a mother holding a crying toddler who had bumped his head, and an older man quietly reading a magazine with a bandage on his arm. The movie crew looked out of place in their dirty, dusty clothes, still covered in the fake grit and sweat from the set. The reality of their job had crashed into the real world, and it was jarring. For a long time, nobody spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the noise of their own worried thoughts. The producer sat with his head in his hands, staring at the floor. The assistant who had handed Keanu the water just hours ago was tapping her foot nervously, her eyes glued to the double-glass doors where he had disappeared. "I don't understand," the stunt coordinator finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough. "He was fine this morning. We did the fight scene 3 times and he was laughing. He didn't say anything hurt." "He never does," the makeup artist whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "That's the problem. He never wants to be a burden. If he was feeling bad, he would have just hidden it so he wouldn't worry us." The director looked up, his eyes red. "I pushed him," he said, his voice shaking. "I kept asking for one more take. I saw him rubbing his side, but I didn't stop. I thought he was just getting into character. I should have stopped it." The stunt coordinator shook his head. "You know Keanu. If you tried to stop him, he would have insisted on going. He's the most stubborn man I know when it comes to getting the shot right. He wants to give the audience everything." They sat there, sharing stories, trying to comfort each other with memories of his kindness. They talked about how he remembered every single crew member's name, from the guy who drove the truck to the lady who served lunch. They remembered how he had surprised the lighting crew with expensive watches last Christmas just to say thank you for working late. He wasn't just a boss or a movie star to them. He was a friend. A good, decent man who didn't deserve to be lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. Time moved very strangely in that waiting room. Sometimes it felt like minutes had dragged on for hours. The large clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. Every time the glass doors opened, everyone's head snapped up, hoping to see a doctor in a white coat coming toward them. But mostly, it was just nurses bringing files or patients being called in for minor things. The sun outside began to set, casting long shadows across the floor. The bright blue sky turned to a soft orange and then a deep, dark purple. The lights inside the hospital seemed to get brighter as the world outside went asleep. The exhaustion of the day started to catch up with the crew. They were tired, hungry, and scared, but nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to go back to the set or go home to sleep. Leaving felt like giving up, and they weren't ready to do that. An elderly janitor pushed a mop past them, slowly cleaning the floor. He looked at the group of dusty, worried people and gave them a sympathetic nod. He didn't know who they were waiting for, but he recognized the look of fear on their faces. It was a universal look, the same look he saw on families every night. A young couple sitting across from them was watching the group closely. The man leaned over and whispered to his partner, "That looks like that movie actor. What's his name? The nice one." His partner squinted for a moment and then her eyes went wide. "Oh my God. That is him, or those are the people he works with. I saw a post online about a shutdown on a film set nearby." The news hadn't broken fully yet, but the rumors were starting to spread like ripples in a pond. The crew pulled their phones out, checking social media and news sites, terrified of seeing a headline that confirmed their worst fears. Thankfully, there was nothing yet. Just silence from the hospital and silence from the internet. Suddenly, the double glass doors swung open again. This time, a doctor in a white coat walked through. He was holding a clipboard and he looked tired. He paused for a moment, scanning the room. The entire movie crew stood up in unison, a wave of movement and hope. The doctor saw them, dirty clothes, desperate faces, and walked over. "Are you here for the patient brought in from the film set?" the doctor asked. He looked older with kind eyes and wrinkles around his mouth that suggested he smiled a lot, though he wasn't smiling now. "Yes," the director stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. Is he okay?" The doctor took a deep breath. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, which felt like an eternity to the group holding their breath. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at them. The silence in the waiting room was absolute. Even the mother with the toddler stopped rocking her child to listen. "He is stable," the doctor said finally. A collective exhale went through the group like air escaping a balloon. "But we are running some extensive tests." His collapse was caused by more than just the heat. We need to figure out exactly what is going on inside his body before we can treat him properly. "Can we see him?" the producer asked. "Not yet," the doctor said gently. "He is resting now and we need the lab results to come back. You should stay here. It might be a little while longer. But I promise, as soon as we know the full picture, I will come out and tell you everything." With that, the doctor turned and walked back through the glass doors, disappearing behind the white walls. The group sat back down, relieved that he was alive, but a new kind of fear settled in their hearts. The doctor's words echoed in their minds, more than just the heat. They looked at each other, the questions plain in their eyes. What was wrong with him? Why did he collapse so suddenly? And would the diagnosis be something they could fix? The waiting continued, but now the stakes felt even higher. The waiting room had grown quiet as the night deepened outside. The large glass doors that separated the emergency area from the rest of the hospital remained closed, acting like a barrier between the terrified crew and the answers they desperately needed. The fluorescent lights continued to hum, a constant, annoying sound that seemed to get louder the longer they sat there. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Most of the other patients had gone home or been moved to rooms upstairs, leaving the movie crew alone in the stiff plastic chairs. They were exhausted. The adrenaline from the panic on the set had worn off hours ago, replaced by a heavy, aching tiredness. The director was slumped in his chair, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The stunt coordinator was staring at a vending machine across the hall, not really hungry, just looking for something to focus on. The makeup artist was resting her head on the producer's shoulder, dozing lightly, but waking up every time she heard a footstep. Suddenly, the familiar sound of the glass doors sliding open broke the silence. Everyone sat up straight, their hearts jumping into their throats. The doctor walked back in. He looked different now. He wasn't rushing. He was walking slowly, holding a thick clipboard against his chest. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked around until he spotted the group of dusty, anxious people in the corner. He walked over to them, his face serious. There were no smiles this time, just a look of deep concern and professional curiosity. He pulled over a chair and sat down opposite them, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "We have the results," the doctor said quietly. "And I have to be honest with you, I have been doing this for a long time and what I am seeing is quite shocking." The crew leaned in, holding their breath. The producer rubbed his hands together nervously. "Is it his heart? Did he have a stroke?" the director asked, his voice trembling. The doctor shook his head slowly. "No, his heart is strong and there was no stroke. That was actually the first thing we checked because given the collapse, we feared the worst. But his heart is remarkably healthy. However, that is actually the confusing part. Because the rest of his body is telling a very different story." He opened the clipboard and tapped a paper with his finger. "When we did the full body scans, we found things that don't add up with how he was acting today. We found multiple hairline fractures in his ribs. We found a compression fracture in his lower spine. And we found severe damage in his shoulder that looks like it has been there for weeks, maybe months." The room went dead silent. The stunt coordinator blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. Fractures, he repeated, but he was jumping off platforms today. He was running, he threw a punch this morning. I know, the doctor said, looking at the stunt man. And that is the shocking part. The human body is designed to shut down when it is in that much pain. It is a defense mechanism. If you or I had those injuries, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed, let alone run and jump. The pain signals should have been overwhelming. The doctor paused, looking at each of them in the eye. On top of the skeletal damage, he is severely dehydrated and suffering from a systemic infection. He hasn't been drinking enough water to flush out the toxins, and his body is fighting a war on the inside. His immune system is completely shot because he hasn't slept properly, and he hasn't been eating. His body basically ran out of fuel while it was trying to repair all these broken bones. The makeup artist let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. He must have been in so much pain, she whispered. Why didn't he tell us? The doctor sighed and closed the clipboard. That is the part that is beyond my medical knowledge. That is a human question. Medically speaking, he collapsed because his body finally hit a wall. The pain, the exhaustion, the infection, it all reached a critical point, and his system just said no more. It is a miracle he didn't collapse sooner. He was functioning on pure willpower. The director took off his hat and ran his hands through his hair, looking sick. I asked him to do the jump again. I saw him wince when he landed, and I thought it was just acting. I thought he was making it look good for the camera. You couldn't have known, the doctor said gently, though his tone was stern. He is very good at hiding it, but I can tell you that he is going to be here for a while. We need to stabilize the infection and manage the pain. He is going to need rest, real rest, for a long time. No stunts, no running. He needs to let his bones heal. The news hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a sudden, tragic accident that took him down. It was a slow accumulation of abuse he had put himself through, likely without telling a soul. They thought about all the times he had joked around on set, all the times he had carried heavy equipment or helped lift props. He had been walking around with a broken back and cracked ribs, smiling and asking people how their day was. It makes me feel terrible, the producer said, his voice tight. We pay him to do a job, but we also care about him. We thought we were taking care of him by having a medic on set. But he was hiding this from the medic, too. People who are that tough often forget to take care of themselves, the doctor said. They think they are invincible. But bones break and bodies get tired, no matter how strong the spirit is. He is lucky that he fell when he did. If he had kept pushing, the infection could have spread to his blood, and that could have been much, much worse. The doctor stood up, signaling that the consultation was over. He is sleeping now. We have given him something for the pain and antibiotics for the infection. He will be groggy when he wakes up, but you can see him for a few minutes. Just one or two of you at a time. He needs to stay calm. As the doctor walked away, the group looked at each other with a mix of relief and horror. He was alive. He wasn't dying of a heart attack. But the image of him, silently suffering through weeks of filming with broken bones, was heartbreaking. It changed everything they thought they knew about the day. It wasn't just a case of heat stroke. It was the result of a man giving everything he had, literally breaking himself piece by piece, just to make a good movie. The guilt sat in the room like a heavy stone, but underneath it was a profound respect for the strength of the man lying behind the glass doors. The director stood up slowly, his legs feeling shaky. I'll go in first, he said. I need to tell him I'm sorry. I need to tell him to stop trying to be a hero and just rest. The others nodded, watching him walk toward the swinging double doors that led to the treatment rooms. They knew that after tonight the movie would be different. The stunts would have to change, the schedule would have to change. But more importantly, they knew they had to protect their friend from himself, because he was never going to ask for help. He would just keep smiling and breaking until he couldn't stand up anymore. And now that they knew the truth, they couldn't let that happen again. The room was spinning slowly when Keanu finally opened his eyes. The bright, fluorescent lights above him felt like they were burning through his eyelids. He tried to lift his hand to block the harsh glare, but his arm felt heavy, like it was made of lead. A soft, rhythmic beeping sound was playing in the background, a steady asterisk beep, beep, beep that matched the slow, dull thumping in his head. He blinked a few times, trying to clear the thick fog from his vision. The white ceiling came into focus, followed by the pale blue curtains hanging around the bed. The smell was unmistakable, that strong, clean scent of disinfectant and soap that only exists in hospitals. He wasn't on the movie set. He wasn't in his trailer. He was in a bed, hooked up to machines. A nurse in blue scrubs noticed he was awake and immediately stepped over to adjust the drip in his arm. "You're back with us," she said softly, giving him a warm, reassuring smile. "Don't try to move too much. You've had a rough day." Keanu tried to speak, but his throat was dry and scratchy like sandpaper. He coughed, which sent a sharp spike of pain through his ribs. He winced, his face tightening up automatically. "Here," the nurse said, holding a plastic cup with a straw to his lips. "Just small sips." The cool water felt amazing as it slid down his throat. He drank a little and leaned his head back against the pillow, memories of the alleyway flooding back. He remembered running. He remembered the crushing heat. He remembered the ground rushing up to meet his face. Then a sudden wave of embarrassment washed over him. He had passed out. He had stopped the production. He had scared everyone. The doctor walked in a few minutes later, holding a tablet in his hands. He looked at Keanu with a mix of professional seriousness and genuine amazement. "Well, you are certainly a medical puzzle," the doctor said, pulling a plastic chair up to the bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Keanu croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Like I slept on a rock." "That would be an understatement," the doctor said gently. He tapped the screen of his tablet and turned it so Keanu could see. "Do you see these white lines here on the spine, and these hairline cracks in the ribs?" Keanu looked at the black and white image of his own skeleton. He stared at the fractures on the screen for a long moment, quiet and still. "I didn't know they were broken," Keanu said quietly. "I just thought I pulled some muscles. I've been sore before." "You know, you just keep going. You take a hot shower and you get back to work." "That is the shock," the doctor said, lowering the tablet. "Most people with a spinal compression fracture cannot even stand up straight, let alone run and jump off platforms. Your body has been compensating for the pain by using other muscles to protect your spine. That is why you are so exhausted. You've been running a marathon with a broken leg, essentially. It is physically remarkable, but it was incredibly dangerous." Keanu looked down at his hands, which were resting on the crisp, white sheets. He felt foolish. He thought he was just being tough, doing his job. He didn't realize he was literally breaking himself apart piece by piece while everyone watched. "I'm sorry," Keanu whispered. "Sorry for what?" the doctor asked, raising an eyebrow. "You didn't do this on purpose." "For causing trouble," Keanu said, looking guilty. "For stopping the shoot. For worrying everyone." The doctor shook his head slowly. "You need to worry about healing right now, not the movie schedule. If you had kept going, if you had taken one more bad fall, you could have paralyzed yourself. You are very lucky that your body finally said enough." Just then, there was a soft knock on the metal frame of the door. The director stepped inside. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and tired, and his clothes were still dusty from the set. He looked smaller than usual, like the energy had been completely drained out of him. Seeing the director look so worried and defeated made Keanu feel even worse. "Hey," the director said softly, walking over to the bed. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he just shoved them deep into his pockets. "Hey," Keanu said back. He tried to smile, but it was weak and tired. "Did we get the shot?" The director let out a short, sad laugh. "You're lying in a hospital bed with a broken back and you're asking about the shot. You're unbelievable, man. I just need to know if the day was wasted," Keanu said earnestly. "We were on a roll. The light was perfect." "The day doesn't matter," the director said, his voice cracking slightly. "I talked to the doctor. I know what's wrong with you. I can't believe you were doing those stunts like that. Why didn't you tell me you were hurt? I wouldn't have made you do it." "I didn't want to let you down," Keanu said simply. "And I didn't want to let the crew down. Everyone works so hard. I didn't want to be the guy who complained about a backache and held everything up." The director reached out and gently squeezed Keanu's shoulder, being careful of the IV line. "You are the most important person on that set. If you go down, the whole thing goes down. You taking care of yourself is taking care of the crew. We can replace a prop or a light, but we can't replace you." Keanu nodded, looking away at the wall. He knew the director was right, but it was hard for him to accept. He was used to being the one who carried things, the one who helped others, not the one who needed carrying. Outside the hospital walls, the word was starting to spread like wildfire. A few news vans had begun to gather in the parking lot, their antennas reaching up like metal trees. People on the internet were already speculating wildly. Was it drugs? Was it a heart attack? Was it a stunt gone wrong? The rumors were flying fast and furious, but nobody knew the truth yet. But inside the quiet room, it was just two friends talking. The noise of the world seemed very far away. How long? Keanu asked, changing the subject back to work. He hated not knowing the plan. The doctor says months, the director said reluctantly. We have to shut down production. We can't film around this. You need to heal properly or you will never be the same. Keanu let out a long, shaky breath. Months. That felt like a lifetime in the movie business. He hated the idea of sitting still while everyone else waited. But looking at the director's tired face and feeling the throbbing, deep ache in his back that the medicine couldn't quite hide, he knew he didn't have a choice. Okay, Keanu said finally. We stop. I heal, then we finish. We will finish, the director agreed firmly. Take all the time you need. The movie will be there. As the director sat down in the visitor's chair, exhausted, the reality of the diagnosis began to truly sink in for Keanu. It wasn't just about a broken bone or an infection. It was about his limits. He had pushed himself past them, thinking he was invincible because that was the character he played on screen. But he wasn't a superhero. He was human. He was fragile. And as he looked at the concern etched into his friend's face, he realized that maybe being human was enough. He didn't have to be indestructible to be loved or respected. He just had to be okay. The nurse came back in to check the monitors, and the two men sat in a comfortable silence. The shock of the day was beginning to fade, replaced by the long, hard road of recovery ahead. But for the first time that day, Keanu allowed himself to stop fighting the pain and just rest. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady beep of the machine. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next move. He was just there. 3 days had passed since the frightening collapse, and the hospital room was finally quiet. The constant beeping of the machines had stopped, and the bustle of nurses coming and in had slowed down. Keanu sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in his own clothes, a simple t-shirt, comfortable jeans, and a worn-out jacket. Moving slowly, he tied the laces of his sneakers, his face grimacing slightly with every bend of his back. The pain was still there, a deep, constant ache that reminded him of the damage his body had taken, but the sharp, blinding agony had faded into a dull throb. He stood up carefully, testing his balance. He felt a bit wobbly, like a newborn deer learning to walk for the first time. A physical therapist stood nearby, ready to catch him if he fell, but Keanu waved him off. He wanted to do this on his own. He took a deep breath, grabbed his small bag of belongings, and walked toward the door. Every step was a victory, but every step also felt like a reminder of how fragile he really was. Walking down the long hallway, toward the exit felt different than walking down a hallway on a movie set. There were no extras, no makeup artists, and no directors yelling "cut." It was just him, the linoleum floor, and the smell of antiseptic. He passed a nurse pushing a cart of medicine, and she stopped to give him a gentle high five. "Take it easy out there," she said with a smile. He nodded, tipping his head to her. He was grateful to the people here who had put him back together, but he was desperate to see the sky. He reached the main lobby of the hospital. It was a bright, open space with glass walls that let in the morning sun. The automatic glass doors slid open with a soft hiss as he approached, and the fresh air hit his face. It was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the recycled air inside the building. He took a moment to just stand there, filling his lungs with the outside world. Waiting for him on the curb was a simple black car. His driver, a loyal man who had been with him for years, was standing by the back door, holding it open. But there was also a small crowd gathered near the entrance. Word had gotten out that he was leaving today. Photographers with cameras and a few fans with notebooks stood behind a makeshift barrier set up by hospital security. Keanu didn't turn around or try to hide. He knew they were there. He also knew that the news of his diagnosis had broken the day before. The world now knew that the action hero had been working with broken bones and a body that was failing him. The headlines hadn't mocked him. Instead, they had been filled with shock and respect. People were amazed that he had endured so much pain just to entertain them. As he walked slowly down the ramp toward the car, the cameras began to click. It wasn't a chaotic swarm like it might have been for a scandal. It was strangely respectful. No one shoved or screamed. They just watched him, capturing his slow, careful walk. He looked frail to them, not like the invincible fighter they saw on screen. And in that fragility, he seemed more real, more human than ever before. Halfway to the car, Keanu stopped. He noticed an older woman standing a bit away from the photographers. She wasn't holding a camera. She was clutching a handbag and wearing a coat that looked a bit too thin for the weather. She looked like a patient, maybe someone who had spent the last few days worrying about her own health. She was looking at him with wide, sad eyes. Keanu hesitated for a second, glancing at his driver, then he changed his path. He walked slowly over to where the woman was standing. The photographers lowered their cameras, watching in silence. The driver looked on with a patient smile, knowing this was just who Keanu was. The woman seemed surprised that he was coming toward her. She straightened her back and nervously patted her hair. "Hi," Keanu said softly, his voice still a bit raspy. "Oh, hello," the woman stammered, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't mean to bother you. I just saw you leaving." "You're not bothering me," Keanu said. He shifted his weight to his good side, trying to take the pressure off his fractured spine. "Are you okay? You look a little tired." The woman was taken aback. Here was a man who had just left the hospital after a serious medical crisis, and he was asking her if she was okay. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I've been here visiting my husband. He's very sick," she whispered. It's been a hard week." Keanu reached out and gently took her hand. His grip was weak, but his touch was warm and grounding. "I'm so sorry," he said sincerely. "I know how hard it is to wait and to worry. You have to be strong for him, but don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You need your energy." The woman squeezed his hand back, nodding as she tried to hold back tears. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for everything you do. I heard about what happened. You take care of yourself now, all right?" "I will," Keanu promised. "I'm going to rest." He gave her hand one last pat before letting go. He didn't rush away. He stood there for a moment longer, just looking at her with those kind, puppy dog eyes that the world loved so much. It was a small interaction, barely 2 minutes long, but to the woman and to everyone watching, it meant everything. It proved that despite his broken body and his exhaustion, his heart was still stronger than his bones. He finally turned and walked the remaining few steps to the car. The driver helped him lower himself into the back seat. Keanu let out a quiet sigh of relief as the soft leather cushions supported him. The driver closed the door gently, sealing him inside the quiet, safe bubble of the car. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the traffic, Keanu looked out the tinted window. The hospital grew smaller in the distance. He saw the photographers packing up their gear. He saw the older woman walking back toward the entrance, wiping her eyes with a tissue. He leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. The diagnosis had shocked everyone because it stripped away the myth of the superhero. It showed the world that he was made of flesh and blood, that he could break, and that he could hurt. But as he sat there, recovering from a crash that almost ended his life, he realized that being human wasn't a weakness. The strength that people admired in him wasn't about how high he could jump or how many punches he could take. It was about how he treated people. It was about stopping to talk to a stranger when he was in pain himself. It was about apologizing to the crew for worrying them. It was about getting back up, slowly and surely, even when his body was telling him to stay down. The car drove smoothly through the city streets, carrying him toward home and a long period of rest. The movie would wait. The stunts could be rescheduled. For now, Keanu Reeves was just a man on his way home. Alive, grateful, and more loved than he had ever been, not because he was a star, but because he was real.